Uh, my name is Rusty Hevelin, and with me here is Art Widner, one of the real old-time beginners of fandom from the Stranger Club in Boston. This interview is being conducted at MagiCon. This is the convention center in Orlando, Florida, and this is September 5th, 1992. And what we're aiming at here, Art, is to simply get on tape some of the history of science fiction and of science fiction fandom in the field generally. And you're an integral part of that as one of the real beginners. To let people know some of the really earliest history, start with your earliest history as far as science fiction is concerned. How did you get involved?
My earliest history, there's an amusing little anecdote about that. When I was teaching, we had a monthly poker group, and one time I walked in, sat down at the poker table, and another guy in the group who read science fiction occasionally and liked to delve into the old pulps tossed a 1934 Astounding across the table at me. They said, "Hey, you go back a long time, don't you?" And I turned it over. The back cover was ripped off, and there was my very first letter to a prozine. Gosh, wow, boy, oh boy, please print some more E.E. Smith and all of that jazz that we all went through. And that 1934 letter was the beginning, and that led to, I think my first correspondent coming out of that letter column was a fan named Harold R. Garrett of Sedalia, Missouri. Mm-hmm. I've never heard of him since. I lost track of him early on, but we used to trade magazines through the mail as well as correspond. Mm-hmm. And those were the days when you could tightly roll up a large size Amazing and put a 3-cent stamp on it, leaving both ends open. And boy, that's a good way to build up your collection and get to read all the stuff that you couldn't afford to buy. Yeah. Because literally, I did not have 2 dimes to rub together to go down to the railroad station and buy a copy of the latest Astounding, which was, of course, my favorite at the time. I used to hang around, and probably you and others did much the same thing. You'd hang around the newsstand at the railroad station and surreptitiously read the magazines until the attendant would get annoyed with us and say,
"Run you off."
"Hey, dork, get out of there." No, dork is anachronism.
A neologism
dork,
since then.
Yeah, dork wasn't invented for a long time after that. I think it was twerp or something like that was the current slang.
But in other words, you did come in directly from the magazines and through the old letter columns in the magazines.
Yeah.
Tell us how you got involved with the Stranger Club.
I got them involved with me because I'd heard about the Lasfas and the Futurians and all of these wonderful faraway places where they actually had 3 or 4 fans who would come and get together and talk about this wonderful stuff. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, there's no club here, so I'll start one, by God. Mm-hmm. And I didn't spell it with an H then either.
Yeah.
But I scoured all the magazines for addresses in and around Boston, and the Stranger Club, I think, after Francis Perrow left our midst, he was the only one that actually resided in Boston. All the rest of us were suburbanites. Mm. And a lucky stroke that I contacted Bob Swisher, among the early ones, and Russ Chauvenet, and they had fairly large houses. I lived in a cramped apartment with my parents, and they frowned upon my activities in that direction. So Chauvenet was a wealthy family, and Swisher was a chemist with Monsanto, and they provided us with the meeting room. Mm-hmm. So The first meeting, I think, was Chauvenet, Swisher, and I can't remember who the others. Singleton might have been there, but that's all I can remember off the top of my head.
Maybe I can jump ahead here a little bit because of a name that you just brought up. Singleton was quite famous in fandom for a short time at any rate because of a pseudo-suicide. Can you fill us in? Do you have any background information on that?
Yeah, you should have been to my slideshow yesterday when I did the Denver ride, and there were pictures of Singleton in amongst the old brownie snapshots that I made slides out of. Singleton was a tall, handsome guy and quite unfannish, like most of us young nerds who were rather short and skinny and socially inept. He was a great hand with the ladies and very bright, terrific poet as well as a scientist, and he was going to MIT at the time that I got in touch with him. So he was kind of our mainstay. He helped me edit Fanfare, which was an early club zine that turned into a genzine and ran the usual 10 issues before it expired, or I burned out. Singleton, as I say, helped with the club zine and went to the first YHOS and ride in an old 1928 Dodge that I own called the Skylark of Woo Woo. A lot of fans named their vehicles Skylark something or other. So
this was in 1940.
This was in 1940, and shortly there, I think that trip sort of burned him out, rubbed him up maybe against one fughead too many or something, and he decided that he didn't want any more of this, and it was interfering with his studies, and he was going back to Texas anyway, so he thought it would be a real joke to pretend to have committed suicide and left our ken. Actually, anyone who would like all the details should consult the Norriscon 3 program book, where they called back the 6 original Stranger Club members that they could find and made us guests of honor at that Worldcon. The Singleton, I wrote about Singleton there and gave all the details, but trying to keep it short. Chauvenet had gone back to Virginia, and his logical mind from down there smelled a rat somewhere, and he wrote to me and said, go over to MIT and talk to Oliver King Smith, who was Singleton's roommate, and see what you could find out. I thought something is wrong here. So I went over, and Smith turned out not to be as smooth a liar and so forth as Singleton was, and I immediately figured something was wrong. Singleton had even gone to the length, as I recall, getting a fake newspaper, like you can get your name in the headlines, and that was pinned up on the wall in case somebody should come investigating, and it was, but it went over the top because they had interviews with various co-ed cuties who said, oh, we shall miss the great master, and what a lover he was, and blah, 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 and so on. And I knew even for Singleton, that was a bit much. So I began doing a Perry Mason number on Smith, and he either admitted or gave me a clue that it was all a hoax, and finally the thing broke down, and we all looked pretty foolish, and so we all, meaning the rest of fandom, because I remember Doc Lowndes of the Futurians wrote a lovely poem in memory of Singleton, which I think I was the angriest of all, because I felt it was only my bounden duty to put out a big dedication issue of Fanfare. And to do that, I had to hectograph it. It was before we could afford a mimeograph. Singleton had been providing an MIT ditto machine to do Fanfare on.
Oh.
And so I went out, not having that available anymore, I went out and bought a little Woolworth's hectograph, and Fanfare had a circulation of around 100, which was fairly large for that time. So I had to make 2 runs. I had to type 2 masters of everything, do the artwork and everything else. So that, I think, started me on the road to the gates of Gaffia. And
most people, of course, in fandom today, for any length of time, understand that Gaffia is getting away from it all.
Yeah.
So we can go right on from there, and those that didn't know now know.
Right.
Let's pursue a little bit more because of something you just touched on here. You really went from the very beginning with the little jelly pan of Hecto stuff through the ditto process and through the mimeograph and now into the photo offset and so forth. Fill in a little bit of what that trail has led to as far as your publications and contacts you made from it.
Well, of course, I had 34 years of semi-gaffiation. In 45. Actually, I lasted till about 1944 when I was drafted into World War II. Got out in 1946, and in the meantime had ceased most of my publishing activities. Going from the Hecto, after that one issue, I said, this is no way to do a fanzine, especially one that I want to compete with Harry Warner's Spaceways or some of the good fanzines of that time. So, got to get a mimeograph. So I conned the Stranger Club membership. We had accumulated a fair amount in the treasury. Didn't have much of anything to do with it except maybe blow a few dollars on picnic supplies or something like that. So I said, let's have if you want me to continue being the editor of Fanfare, I very much want to, but we need to get a mimeograph. And Sears Roebuck has a very nice one for $25. Well, this today would be considered the Model T of mimeographs, long before Gestetner and what are they, Rex Rotary. I never had one of those. And Roneo, is that another one?
Roneo is another.
This was about as simple as it could get. Just a drum on which you hooked a sort of a fleecy pad of cloth, and which you then painted with a paintbrush. No automatic inking, any of that stuff. And once you had the pad well soaked with ink, it was then fairly easy to reach inside where there were a number of perforations, and you could paint light spots. You look carefully at your last copy that was beginning to show desert in the lower right-hand corner, and then you would figure out, well, that's got to be right about there, and you'd dab some ink on it, and invariably you'd get too much, and so that particular corner would be extra black and gooey looking for a while. And if you wanted to do colors, which remarkably there was a group called the Decker Dillies in Decker, Indiana, and they put out a very fine-looking zine, even by today's standards, called Pluto. And they would get their colors, and when they would do 2 colors on one page, that meant a double run. You had to laboriously take off the stencil, take off the pad, clean up whatever color of ink you had on it with turpentine or something, and then put on the new pad, get it all inked up, and then it's the devil's own job trying to get registration, so you wouldn't run over into the other part of the page. And I did not go through the Gestetner phase. I think electro stencils came in fairly early on, because I remember reading enviously about YHOS, and they owned an electro stencil in the 50s, I think. You could correct me on that.
In the 50s or 60s, anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, it all got to be too much work, and I wanted to move to California, because I had perhaps even surpassed your remarkable achievements in hitchhiking, in that I think I hitchhiked the longest distance to a convention and returned from Boston to Los Angeles for the 1946 Pacificon. This was slightly before you came on the scene. No, you came on the scene in Denver in 41, right? But anyway, you can correct me on that.
I didn't realize you had hitchhiked to Pacificon.
Yeah, I did. My parents had moved to California in 1942, so I came out in 46. I visited them. And then I cheated a little bit. I took the bus from San Jose down to L.A. And
that's forgivable.
Huh?
That's forgivable.
Yeah. But it was quite remarkable. Of course, again, I cheated a little bit in that I kept my Army uniform with the insignia taken off, and of course, at that time, few people could resist a serviceman. Yes, this is one of our boys that fought for us and so forth. Actually, I didn't fight. I stayed in the United States the whole time in a research lab, but it made getting rides easier. I went from coast to coast on $7 in 7 days. That included eating, maybe 2 hotel rooms. The rest of the time I just kept going and slept in the cars and so forth. But that's a whole other story. To come back to publishing, of course I didn't do any until 1979.
Let's switch from the technical side of it a little bit and fill people in a little bit on the actual the magazine titles and some of your contributors and so forth.
Oh, of the 40s?
Of the 40s, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thought I had a pretty good zine. I had a column by Harry Warner. I had a column by Joe Gilbert called Slander, which was sort of a killer review and critical writing, rather callow, but good for the time. Joe Gilbert was one of the few South Carolina fans that ever showed up. He and his buddy Harry Jenkins lived in Columbia, South Carolina, and they shone brightly for a while and disappeared, and were never heard of again, as far as I know.
They published 2 or 3 issues of a very good little fanzine too for a while.
Yes, and let's see, who was my other? I had H.C. Koenig of their own Petard fame. He was older than the rest of us, maybe by about 10 years or so, which made him look as, ancient and creaky to us teenagers in early 20s. So he liked to do a column, and he was rather tart and sharp-tongued in print, and his specialty was poking fun at science fiction stories which were poorly written. Particularly, his first name was H.C., and that resulted in being dubbed Hiss Koenig, because he liked to collect examples of villains who were hissing. And they usually they hissed very improbable sentences full of K's and various gutturals, which would be impossible to hiss. Oh, kick me out, would you? He hissed, you know, that sort of thing. And that was a lot of fun. The early Damon Knight, a piece of, if you ever play fan trivia games, you can maybe nail people on this. What was the pseudonym used by Damon Knight in the one column that he did for Fanfare shortly before it ended, and he fled east to the Futurians? The name was Ritter Conway, and you can reverse it, and you can say, who was Ritter Conway? And people, Ritter Conway, some obscure writer of the pulps, but it was Damon Knight. And you ask about fanzines of the period. One of the very best was Damon Knight's Snide.
2 issues only, but
yeah,
magnificent.
Very good, high-level satire and criticism of the field, and he just continued on through a whole lifetime of that. Though he left fandom not long after he went to New York and joined the Futurians and became a professional and started writing for the Futurian magazines, etc. Who else did I have in Fanfare? I think I had one other columnist. Well, Jack Chapman missed. Oh, I don't remember. Yes, did a column. I sort of specialized in picking up would-be Gaffieates who I could see were starting to burn out. They were tired of doing their own zine, and I said, "Hey, it'll be easy. Do what you like to do as a column for me, and I'll publish it." So I would pick them up after they burned out. Of course, there was Harry Warner's Spaceways, which ran, I think, around nearly 4 years, from 38 to 42. No, it went into 43.
Went into 43.
I don't know whether it went to 44 or not, but it was very good. And Harry, being probably the most responsible person who ever lived, was faithful to his readers and subscribers. In those days, more people subscribed to fanzines than is now the case, where it mostly is you get the fanzine for trade for your fanzine or for contributing an article, a letter, artwork, or what have you. That is something that has changed over the years. But then it used to be 10 cents, 3 for a quarter, and that's where the Fanish term sticky quarters came from, because we would stick a quarter to a 3x5 card with Scotch tape and send it in the mail to the fanzine of our choice. And if we were lucky, we might get 3 issues before it died. But Harry kept on monthly, month after month. He ground that thing out on an old-fashioned mimeograph, much like it was a little better. I think it was an early A.B. Dick, a little bit better than my Sears Roebuck. And the quality level was always high. There were a few bombs now and then, but most of it was very good.
Well, Harry is still, I understand, Harry is still publishing Horizons in the Fantasy Amateur Press Association after over 50 years. He's been doing that. But let's turn back to you on that. You were in FAPA. Did YHOS first appear in FAPA?
Yes, it did. At the auction last night, I sold a complete run of YHOS from number 1 to the present time. The first 2 issues were hectographed on the hectograph that I bought to do Fanfare. But since FAPA at that time had only 50 members, or maybe even fewer, the limit was set. I think the first limit was 35, but I wasn't in at the very beginning, which was 1937. The only person who has been in it from the very first to the very last is Jack Spear, who was here at the convention also.
Oh, is Jack here?
Yes, Jack
I
was
haven't
here,
seen him.
and he showed up at the slideshow. Not only was he present on the big screen, but he was there in person.
Right.
So Jack was one of the founding fathers, along with a number of the Futurians, notably Donald A. Walheim, who was later to go on and publish Daw books, and Michelle and Lowndes, and Madel of your friend from Philadelphia, and who helped to bring you into Convention 1. Yeah, I haven't seen him this whole convention. That's the trouble with these modern conventions. They're too big. But now we've got the con within the con, so that the old timers and the true fans can get together amidst all of these sort of spin-off fandoms that have grown up in the meantime.
All right, can I check your watch just a moment here? Okay, fine, we're doing good.
So Harry's Spaceways was good. I saw a copy of Ad Astra in the History of Fanzines down here. That was done by Mark Reinsberg in Chicago. Was very good. There, actually, I should make a correction at this point. 1934 was not the beginning, to go back to the beginning of fandom as we know it, although there probably were people who could be called fans but who were not in contact with each other before 1926, when Amazing Stories arrived on the scene. Shortly after that, Aubrey McDermott, who is still around, and Cliff Amsbury, who's still around, published a little club zine for the International Science Association, a grandiose sounding title. I don't think either one of them knew all that much about science, but it was called the Comet, and it is their contention that that was the first fanzine of modern times. Usually the credit goes to I think Conrad Ruppert and the Time Traveler, was it called? Yeah, which was 1930. Yeah. But Aubrey McDermott was writing letters to the old Argosy magazine at the age of 9 in 1919 when I was 2 years old. So I think if anyone deserves to be called the first fan, he does, unless it is H.P. Lovecraft, because Helen Wesson of FAPA, who's been at FAPA since near the beginning, Xeroxed me a copy that she has of the Rhode Island Astronomer's Journal, which Lovecraft put out as a teenager in high school for friends and so forth, and made carbon copies. Yeah. And the one issue that I have, which is 1903, I think it actually started in shortly after the invention of the hectograph, which was, I believe, in 1894. Lovecraft, I think, started 1898 and did the Rhode Island Astronomer's Journal. And one of their articles in it was, "Will man ever reach the moon?" And that's sufficiently fanish for me to say, HP, you did the first fanzine.
Might well justify that, right. The aim perhaps was a little different, but the
thrust, yeah.
The thrust of it was there, that's right. Well, now, going back to YHOS for just a moment, you might explain the title, and were you had an interrupted run in FAPA. You've already mentioned that you had a semi-gaffeation period. How long were you in the Amateur Press Association initially, and then when did you get back in currently?
Okay, approximately 10 years. Started in 39. I think I can lay claim to getting in 39. I had heard about it, and the original intention of FAPA, or Fantasy Amateur Press Association, which was modeled after printers what we call mundane associations, the National Amateur Press Association, which had Lovecraft and Weston and many others in it, was a group of amateur printers who were more interested in aesthetic book design and layout and high quality printing on little hand presses than they were in content, which I think was from the first fanzine was more interested in content. Although a friend of mine who's still around and who I did not meet in person for some 53 years, I just only recently went over to Lakeport, California, where he still lives, and met him, and that's Claire P. Beck, who put out the Science Fiction Critic in 1934 and a few up till about 1936. He printed that on a little hand press. He couldn't afford a stapler or anything to hold it together, so he had the ingenious idea of using his mother's sewing machine, and he sewed the edges. Fans were nothing if not invented. If they didn't have the means to do what they wanted to do, they found a way to do it by hook or by crook.
Well, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, but so is depression.
Yes, depression. Yep, tell me about it. Well, anyway, you asked about the beginnings of YHOS. I'd heard about the FAPA and their imitation of NAPA, the National Press Association. And there was an early satire zine which rivaled, or perhaps Snide may have been modeled after it, I don't know. It was done by a LA fan named Fred Schroyer. It's called Sweetness and Light. And this was available only in FAPA. And I started to say that the original intention of FAPA was to gather all the fanzines then being published, genzines and all. There was no such thing really as an apazine to start out with. It was different from any other kind of a fanzine. Most fanzines were collections of articles and stories by other fans and perhaps some editorial material, and you put it together in the imitation of a prozine and contents page and the whole bit, and you sold subscriptions, and that's the way it went until it evolved into what we know today. So fairly early on, I think by the time I got in, it was going very much toward the APAs that they ultimately developed into. So Sweetness and Light I wanted to get. I had to have it one way or another. So I joined FAPA through Harry, and I had published some things in Spaceways. Notably was, I think, probably the first extensive trip report kind of journalism that has come to be a staple of fan writing these days. And in December of 1939 or January of 1940, I'm not certain which, because the number one YHOS is not pinned this down, but I've narrowed it down that far. I did the first issue, and what should I call it? Well, there were various zines like Jack Spear's Synap and Sustaining Program that were largely personal and autobiographical and almost entirely editorial written. And so I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I don't want to compete with my own zine fanfare, and I didn't feel that I could afford to put that in. So I said, what shall I call it? Well, it's about me. Who am I? And I had taken to an early fanish conceit, which was to sign letters instead of, we ran out of neologisms and futurisms to sign our letters, or futuristically yours, or what did Virginia Kid, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and other various teenage witticisms. And so I went back in time and said, would sign my letters, your humble obedient servant, like George Washington. And then that got a little bit tiresome, and fandom is great for abbreviations and acronyms. So that soon got shortened to YHOS. So I said YHOS, nice and short, looks good on the cover and so forth. That's what I'll call it, and I kept it that way. And it was only until it was never pronounced, I don't think, until its reincarnation in 1979, and I went to conventions and people said, can I get a copy of YHOS or YHOS or YHOS? And I got tired of all of these Midwestern wimpy zone pronunciations, so I said, let's give it a little bit of class, let's give it a French pronunciation. It's called YHOS, and it's my zine, and it'll be pronounced the way I say. So it's called YHOS. But then to fanishly complicate matters, I said, somebody said, well, I have most of the YHOSes that have been printed, and I was wondering how I could get the missing ones, and I don't know, God, that grates on my ear too. But a simple ES, French or English plural, we'll give it a Hebrew plural, so it is one YHOS and two YHOSim.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you for the Science Fiction Oral History Association, Art, and maybe we can do this again sometime, because I think you have pulled out some facts that most people are not aware of about that period, and I wish I had gotten to your the Widner ride, because I just want to check and make sure you were telling the truth.
Can't do everything in one day.
I,
well, you were there, so you know.
Right.
My pleasure.
Well, thanks a lot. Enjoyed talking with you again.